LSAT logical reasoning questions involving numbers and percentages are becoming increasingly common on the LSAT now that LSAC can no longer test these concepts in the logic games section because, of course, there is no more logic games section. Instead, they've chosen to test these concepts in the logical reasoning section more and more over time. Today, I'll walk you through how to tackle these tricky questions and avoid common mistakes. Why are these questions so tricky? Because they exploit how we naturally misinterpret numerical data. The test makers use our implicit assumptions against us, but the good news is that these questions are not about math, they're about logic. And once you understand the patterns, you can even predict the correct answer. Today, I'll walk you through it step by step. Before I do, for those who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005, and I personally increased my own LSAT score from a 152 to a 175. Now, when you see a question in logical reasoning involving numbers and percentages, your first step should be to ask, are these numbers and percentages central to the argument, or are they meant to be a distraction? You want to know what is the focus of the argument. So, for example, if we had a stimulus saying something like, a city's online grocery sales increased by 200% this year, so online shopping is now the dominant way people buy groceries. Is this about total sales or is it about percentages? Without knowing how much of the market online sales represented last year or the total size of the grocery market, the conclusion here falls apart. So you always want to ask yourself whether the numbers and percentages are central or they're just thrown in to mislead you. Your second step should be to identify the key elements in the question. Every number and percentage question is going to involve the total size that we're dealing with, a specific number within that total, and the percentage that number represents. For example, if we had a question involving a local bookstore that sold 300 more books this year than last year, but its market share decreased, for example, let's suppose we had a logical reasoning stimulus saying something like the following. A local bookstore sold 300 more books this year than last year, but its market share decreased. That would be a paradox, for example. How is it possible? Perhaps the total number of books sold in the city increased by an even greater amount. If you know 2 out of those 3 elements, you'll be able to infer the third. Again, the 3 elements being the total, a specific number within that total, and the percentage that number represents. If you're missing one, it's possible that the argument might be flawed or incomplete, and that is why we have this seeming paradox. Now, you want to look for the missing piece, of course. These questions thrive on ambiguity. LSAC loves to exploit the ambiguity in this situation, and that's why the stimulus is only going to give you part of the picture. So let's say a restaurant served 1,000 more meals this year than last year, and they conclude from this that its popularity must have increased. What's missing here, of course, is the total number of meals served in that area. If other restaurants in the area experienced even larger growth, it is actually possible that this restaurant's relative popularity may have decreased. So you always want to ask yourself, what key information is missing? You also want to track changes over time. Be very careful when you see them making changes over time, referencing months or years or any sort of before or after, because an increase in one area doesn't necessarily mean an increase overall. For example, let's suppose we had a stimulus saying the following. A small town had 2,000 young people last year and 4,000 young people this year, so the youth population must represent a greater share of the total population today. Not necessarily. If the town's total population also grew significantly, let's say it grew from 10,000 to 50,000, the percentage of young people might have actually dropped. So when you see the numbers changing, always look at the entire picture. Of course, LSAC loves to test flawed reasoning in arguments involving numbers and percentages. You might see flaws assuming that a bigger number necessarily means a bigger percentage, when of course it doesn't necessarily mean that. On the flip side, they love to assume that a smaller percentage means a smaller number. Again, not necessarily the case, or they may ignore the impact of the total size. So, for example, let's suppose we had an argument saying a new brand sold 10,000 units this year, more than any other brand, so it must have the largest market share. Why is this flawed? If we don't know the total number of units sold across all brands, we can't conclude anything about market share. Maybe the market is 500,000 units, in which case 10,000 units would be, of course, a very small percentage. And of course, you want to evaluate the conclusion. First thing is check whether the stimulus contains a conclusion. If not, of course, it's a fact set, in which case you're probably dealing with a paradox question or maybe an inference question. If there is a conclusion, it's typically going to be flawed by confusing numerical relationships, again, absolute numbers versus percentages. If there is no conclusion at all there, you want to look for the missing information that you would need in order to make an inference. For example, if we have an argument saying an online retailer's sales volume doubled this year, so therefore its revenue must have doubled, this is assuming the price of the items sold didn't change. The volume of items sold doesn't tell us about anything about the revenue necessarily, because we don't know the price. If the prices were slashed in half, the increase in sales wouldn't necessarily lead to higher revenue. The good news here, of course, is that the LSAT is not actually asking you to do math. You don't need a calculator. Your goal here is to simply understand how numbers and percentages relate to each other and whether the argument holds up given any potential ambiguity. If you focus on the relationships, not doing math equations or formulas, you'll be able to avoid the traps and choose the right answer. Now, I'm going to give you one more example, but before I do, I wanted to let you know that this is a topic that we cover at LSAT Unplugged in our one-on-one coaching programs and in our small group coaching programs as well. We'll also create for you a personalized day-by-day study plan to help you focus on mastering numbers and percentages in LSAT logical reasoning. If this is an area that you're still struggling with, or of course anything else that you need on your journey to scoring a 170 plus on the LSAT whenever you're taking it, if you're interested in finding out more, you can check out the links below to book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to help you out. Now, before I go, I am going to share with you one more example here testing these concepts. If we had an argument saying a university doubled its number of graduate applications this year, so the percentage of graduate students in the student body must have increased. What's missing from this argument? The total size of the student population. If undergraduate enrollment tripled, the percentage of graduate students might have actually decreased. Additionally, just because they got more graduate applications doesn't necessarily mean they admitted more graduate level students. They might have just increased their selectivity and maintained the same number of graduate students admitted to the program. So you always want to question the relationship between numbers and totals before you jump to conclusions. Anyway, folks, that's all for now. I hope you found the video helpful. If you did, please feel free to reach out. My team and I would be glad to support you on your journey to mastering the LSAT and achieving a top score. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.